It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and the streets of Crescent Falls were mostly empty. Samuel, an Uber driver who had seen it all, navigated through the peaceful town, looking forward to the end of his shift. The faint hum of his car engine was the only sound in the late-night air, but he was used to the calm. His passengers usually ranged from tired workers heading home to students after a late-night study session. But tonight, things were different. His phone buzzed with a new ride request. It wasn't far, a pickup just around the corner. He pulled up to the curb and saw a man standing outside, cloaked in a long, dark coat, his head bowed slightly as if in deep thought. The man's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Samuel could tell that he was older, his posture rigid but dignified. The man opened the door and climbed into the back seat without a word. Samuel greeted him with a simple, "Good evening." He glanced at the man through the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his sharp features, weathered skin, and a deep, penetrating gaze. Something about the man felt different. He had an aura of calm, almost as if he didn't belong in the chaotic world outside. "Where to?" Samuel asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Just drive," the man replied softly, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge. "I'll tell you when to stop." Samuel's curiosity piqued. He was used to all sorts of passengers, but this one felt like a mystery unfolding in the back seat. He couldn't help but wonder who this man was and what his purpose was on such a quiet night. His instincts told him there was more to this ride than just a simple fare. As Samuel drove, the silence between them grew, the tension thickening. The passenger's eyes were closed as though he were meditating, but Samuel could feel his attention lingering in the air. It was as if the man was searching for something, or perhaps waiting for something to happen. "What brings you to Crescent Falls, if you don't mind me asking?" Samuel finally broke the silence, hoping to start a conversation, to understand the quiet passenger better. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his lips parted in a small, almost imperceptible smile. When he spoke, his voice was low, but there was a weight to it. "I'm looking for redemption," he said, his words lingering in the air. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "Redemption?" he repeated, unsure what the man meant by that. "Yes," the passenger replied, his gaze now fixed on Samuel through the rearview mirror. "Everyone is searching for redemption in their own way, but not all are worthy of it." Samuel's mind raced, unsure of how to respond. Who was this man, and why was he so cryptic? The air in the car grew heavy with unspoken tension, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving this man towards something far more profound than just a destination. The passenger's eyes met Samuel's in the mirror again, a deep understanding between them, though Samuel could not yet grasp the full weight of what was happening. The road ahead stretched out like a darkened tunnel, but Samuel knew one thing for certain. This ride was unlike any other. The car's tires hummed over the smooth asphalt as Samuel drove, but the tension in the air felt anything but calm. The stranger in the back seat remained still, his presence oddly commanding despite his quiet nature. Samuel tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the man's cryptic words. "Everyone is searching for redemption." Redemption for what? Samuel thought, his curiosity growing by the second. He had met all sorts of people in his line of work, but this man, this priest, or whatever he was, felt different. The weight of his silence was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. It was as if the man was carrying a burden, one that Samuel couldn't begin to understand. The passenger hadn't moved since he'd entered the car, his eyes still closed, his hands folded in his lap. Samuel stole another glance at him through the rearview mirror. The hat still shielded his face, but there was something serene about his expression, as if he were lost in thought, or perhaps waiting for something. "Do you often speak to strangers like this?" the man asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. His words were calm but had an underlying sharpness to them, like a warning hidden behind politeness. Samuel swallowed hard. "I talk to people all the time. It's part of the I guess," he replied, his voice betraying a slight unease. "But it's rare to meet someone like you." The man didn't respond right away, but his lips quirked up slightly, as though he'd expected that answer. "I suppose it's true what they say. People are not as they appear, are they? What seems simple is often far more complex." Samuel's eyes flicked toward the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. What was the man getting at? Was he trying to hint at something more than just a ride? The unease that Samuel had been feeling earlier deepened. He was used to small talk with his passengers, but the conversation now felt too pointed, too meaningful. "What do you mean by that?" Samuel asked cautiously, unsure of where the conversation was heading, but unable to keep his curiosity in check. The priest's gaze shifted toward him, his eyes intense under the brim of his hat. "Not all of us are as we seem. We wear masks, pretending to be something we're not, hiding from who we really are. But sooner or later, those masks fall away. And then the search for redemption begins." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. There was a strange sense of foreboding in the priest's words. The air in the car felt heavier now, almost suffocating. The weight of his gaze was pressed on Samuel, making him feel as if the man could see right through him. "You're not what you seem either, are you?" the priest asked, as though reading his thoughts. Samuel felt a cold sweat trickle down his neck. What was the man implying? Was he talking about him? Or was this all just some kind of game? He had always prided himself on being an easygoing guy, someone who didn't carry any baggage. But something about the way the priest spoke made him question his own life, his own choices. "No," Samuel replied after a long pause. "I guess I'm not. But who is?" The priest's smile was small, but knowing, and for a moment Samuel thought he saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of something dangerous, like a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness. "There's always a price to pay for redemption," the priest said softly, his voice tinged with something darker now. "And the question is, are you willing to pay it?" The words lingered in the air like a cloud of smoke, and Samuel could feel his heart race. Was this some kind of test? Was the priest talking about something in Samuel's own life? Was this about him, or was it something larger, more dangerous? He didn't know, but he had to know more. "I don't know if I understand," Samuel admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "What exactly are you saying?" The priest's eyes never left him. "The truth is like a mirror. We only see what we want to see, but when it cracks, the reflection is undeniable." The conversation had taken a sharp turn into something far more unsettling than Samuel had expected. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, as though they were driving into a place from which there would be no return. But even as he felt a growing dread in his chest, Samuel knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary ride, and no matter how far they drove, the journey had only just begun. The car glided through the empty streets of Crescent Falls, but Samuel felt like he was driving through a fog that had settled not just outside, but inside his own mind. The priest's words echoed in his ears, each one heavier than the last, like a riddle he couldn't quite solve. "There's always a price to pay for redemption," the priest had said, his voice cold and knowing. "Are you willing to pay it?" Samuel's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. What did that even mean? And why did it feel like the priest was talking about something deeper than just a ride? The unease that had started as a small, nagging feeling had now become a full-blown tension, wrapping itself around Samuel's chest. It was as if every mile they drove pulled him deeper into the priest's web, each word a thread that was slowly tightening. The priest, as still as a statue in the back seat, seemed to sense Samuel's inner turmoil. Without warning, he spoke again, breaking the thick silence. "You've made choices, haven't you, Samuel?" The priest's voice was a low murmur, as though speaking to himself more than to Samuel. "We all have. Some of them we regret. Some of them we can never take back." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. How did the priest know his name? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the answer eluded him. He hadn't told the priest his name. The app had, but the priest shouldn't have known that unless— "Who are you?" Samuel asked, his voice shaking slightly, though he tried to keep it steady. "What do you want from me?" The priest's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't want anything from you, Samuel. I'm just a messenger. Someone who shows up at the right moment. But what I can tell you, my son, is this. Redemption always comes with a card. It comes when we're least prepared for it." The air in the car grew heavier, and Samuel felt a chill creep up his spine. He wanted to look back at the priest to see his expression, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at him. The more the priest spoke, The more his words felt like a trap, and Samuel could feel himself being pulled toward it, like a moth to a flame. "What do you mean, least prepared for it?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. "How could anyone be prepared for redemption?" The priest let out a long, slow breath, almost as if he were savoring the question. "Redemption is a process, Samuel. It's the journey we all take when we've lost something, or when something has been taken from us. But it's not a clean journey. It's full of struggles, decisions, and consequences. And sometimes you don't even know what you've lost until you are forced to face it." Samuel could feel his heartbeat quicken. The priest's words were like a mirror being held up to his soul, and for the first time, Samuel began to question everything. What had he lost? What did the priest know? And why did this man seem so intent on making him confront it? The car's headlights flickered as they passed a dark alley, casting a brief shadow over the road ahead. Samuel thought he saw something in the corner of his eye, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. But when he turned his head, the alley was empty. It was just another part of the night, blending into the darkness. "Do you think you're beyond redemption, Samuel?" the priest asked, his voice breaking through Samuel's thoughts. The question hung in the air like a weight, and Samuel's chest tightened. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure if he even knew what redemption meant. He thought of his past, his mistakes, his regrets, and felt the heavy burden of them settle into his bones. "No," Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I am. But I don't know if I'm ready to face what I've done." The priest's smile grew wider, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "That, my son, is where the true test lies." The car continued down the road, the silence growing between them. But this time it felt different. The air wasn't just quiet, it was charged, filled with an energy that Samuel couldn't explain. It was as if the priest's presence was pulling something to the surface, something Samuel had buried deep within himself. And in that moment, Samuel realized he was no longer just driving a passenger. He was driving towards something much darker, something that would change everything. The car's headlights cast long shadows on the road ahead, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence between Samuel and the priest. The world outside felt distant, as though the car was its own isolated world, drifting through an endless night. Samuel's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in the cryptic words the priest had spoken. Redemption, choices, consequences. It was as if every part of his life had been laid bare, ready to be examined by this mysterious stranger in the back seat. "Do you believe in fate, Samuel?" the priest asked suddenly, his voice soft but penetrating, as though he were testing Samuel's resolve. Samuel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "Fate?" he repeated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know. I guess I never really thought about it much. I just try to live my life day by day." The priest's eyes remained fixed on Samuel through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Day by day, that's what most people say. But fate has a way of finding us, whether we're ready for it or not." Samuel felt a chill creep up his spine. He had never believed in fate. To him, life was a series of choices and consequences, nothing more, nothing less. But now, with the priest sitting silently in the back seat, every word seemed to carry weight, and the air felt thicker, like something was closing in on him. "You're not just a priest, are you?" Samuel blurted out, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're something else. You've been speaking to me, like you know things about me. How do you know about my past?" The priest's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it, just cold understanding. "I've seen many souls, Samuel. Some seek redemption, others just wish to forget. But all of them are the same in one way. They're running from something, and they will keep running until they face what they've been avoiding." Samuel's heart raced. He felt like the priest's words were cutting into him, each one deeper than the last. He hadn't expected a ride to take him on such an emotional journey. What was the priest really getting at? And why had he singled Samuel out? "Running from something?" Samuel echoed, his voice tight. "What are you talking about? What is it that I'm running from?" The priest's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Samuel saw a flicker of something almost human in the otherwise stoic gaze. "You know the answer deep down. You've been running for years, from the choices you've made, from the things you've buried inside you. But one day you'll have to stop running. A heavy silence filled the car. Samuel's thoughts raced. The past, choices. He couldn't shake the feeling that the priest was speaking about something far more personal, something Samuel had long tried to forget, something that had haunted him for years. "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. "What do you want from me?" The priest's voice softened, almost pitying. "I'm not here to make you do anything, Samuel. I'm here to show you that the truth is already inside you. The question is whether you'll be able to face it, to face yourself." Samuel's head spun. He couldn't stop the flood of memories that surged forward, each one more painful than the last. The mistakes he'd made, the people he'd hurt, the years he'd spent pretending to be someone he wasn't. Was that what the priest was talking about? The life he had run from? "I don't know if I can face it," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The priest leaned forward, his gaze intense in the rearview mirror. "Strength doesn't come from running, Samuel. It comes from standing still, from facing the darkness that you've been avoiding. And only then can you find redemption." Samuel's grip on the wheel loosened slightly, but the weight of the priest's words was suffocating. He didn't know where this ride was taking him, but he was beginning to understand that it was more than just a simple drive. The road ahead was much darker than he had anticipated, and with every mile, the shadows in his own mind grew closer. "Where are we going?" Samuel finally asked, his voice hoarse. The priest's smile was barely visible, but it was enough to send a shiver down Samuel's spine. "We're going to the place where it all began," he replied. "The place where you can't hide from yourself anymore." Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he drove, the weight of the priest's words pressing down on him like a stone lodged in his chest. Every turn of the wheel felt heavier, as though the road itself were leading him into something inevitable, something he could no longer avoid. "We're going to the place where it all began." The priest's words echoed in his mind, like a haunting refrain that refused to fade. What did that mean? Where was this place? And what exactly was Samuel supposed to confront? The silence in the car was suffocating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Samuel wasn't sure where to turn. He had lived his life thinking he could control everything, his choices, his destiny, but now it felt like he was simply along for the ride with no control over where it would end. "Where is this place?" Samuel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting the priest's gaze. The man's expression remained unreadable, his eyes still and unblinking. "It's not about the location, Samuel," the priest said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "It's about confronting the truth that you've hidden away for so long." Samuel clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew exactly what the priest meant. There was something in his past, something buried so deep that he had spent years trying to forget. The mistakes, the guilt, the shame, it had all been pushed into the darkest corners of his mind, never to be spoken of again. But now it felt like that darkness was coming for him, pulling him toward it like a force he couldn't escape. As they continued to drive, the road began to feel longer, the shadows outside growing darker, more oppressive. Samuel glanced at the priest again, his curiosity and dread mixing in equal measure. "What is it you want from me? Why are you here?" The priest's eyes softened, his voice now more gentle than before. "I'm not here to punish you, Samuel. I'm here to help you. Redemption comes when we face the things we've hidden from ourselves, and it's never too late to change." Samuel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he believed the priest or not. Part of him wanted to lash out, to reject everything the man was saying, but deep down he knew there was some truth in those words. The mistakes of his past had haunted him for years, and no matter how much he tried to outrun them, they always followed. Could this strange man really offer him redemption? Or was this just another illusion, another lie to trap him in a false sense of hope? As they neared the outskirts of the town, the road became more winding, the lights of the city disappearing behind them. They were heading toward the old part of Crescent Falls, the area where the abandoned buildings and forgotten streets lay hidden in the darkness. The priest didn't say a word as Samuel turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street. The buildings here were old, worn down by time and neglect, their windows dark and empty. It was a place Samuel had avoided for years, a place that felt as though it had been forgotten by everyone, including him. Samuel slowed the car, stopping in front of an old, crumbling church. It was run down, its steeple cracked and leaning, but there was something about it that felt familiar. Something about the place tugged at Samuel's memory, though he couldn't place it. "This is it," the priest said softly, his voice almost reverent. "The place where it all began." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. His heart began to race. He had been here before. He had seen this church when he was a child. He had walked past it countless times, but there was something about it now that felt different. Something heavy, something that seemed to weigh on him, pulling him back into a past he had long buried. I don't, I don't remember this place," Samuel whispered, the unease growing inside him. The priest turned to look at him, his gaze steady. "You do remember, Samuel. You just don't want to." The air in the car grew thick, suffocating. Samuel's mind spun, memories flickering like shadows just beyond his grasp. He had to face it. He had to face whatever it was he had been running from. The priest opened the door and stepped out, turning back to look at Samuel. "Come inside, Samuel. The truth is waiting for you." Samuel sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at the old church in front of him. The weight of the priest's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You do remember, Samuel. You just don't want to." His pulse quickened as his eyes darted to the building. It felt like the past had reached out and grabbed him, dragging him back to a place he'd spent years trying to forget. The priest's presence seemed to linger in the car, even after he stepped out. Samuel knew he had to follow, that this was the moment. There was no turning back now, but something inside him hesitated, a deep fear clawing at him. What if the priest was right? What if confronting his past meant confronting everything he had been running from? Taking a deep breath, Samuel opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. The chill of the evening settled over him, but it wasn't the weather that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling that he was walking into something far darker than he had anticipated. The church loomed ahead, its broken windows and crumbling stonework seeming like a shadow of its former self. Yet something about it felt familiar, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. The priest stood in front of the church waiting for him, and his calm demeanor had not changed, but there was an intensity in his eyes now, something that pierced through the darkness around them. "Come," the priest said, his voice soft yet commanding. "The truth waits inside." Samuel didn't know what compelled him to follow. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps the need to finally put his past to rest. But with each step toward the church, a part of him wanted to turn back, to run as far as he could. But he didn't. He couldn't. There was no escape from this. The door creaked open as they entered the church. The interior was just as abandoned and decayed as the exterior. Dust motes danced in the air, caught in the faint light from a single flickering candle at the altar. The wooden pews were long gone, replaced by broken chairs and scattered debris. The silence in the church was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the old stone floor. "Do you remember this place, Samuel?" the priest asked, his voice now quieter, almost reverent. "Do you remember what happened here?" Samuel's heart raced. He couldn't answer. He was afraid of what he might remember. His mind screamed at him to turn and leave, but his legs carried him deeper into the church. The priest's gaze followed him, unblinking, as if urging him to look closer, to confront whatever had been buried inside him for so long. As they reached the altar, the priest stopped and gestured toward a dusty, old box that sat on the floor. "Open it," he instructed. Samuel stared at the box, unsure of what he might find. His breath quickened as he crouched down and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small, worn journal. His fingers trembled as he picked up the journal, the leather cover faded with age. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the first few pages. The handwriting was familiar, and as his eyes traveled down the page, memories began to stir in his mind. The words on the page seemed to come alive, and with them, images of a younger Samuel, a boy filled with hope, filled with dreams, living a life that had once felt so simple. But the further he read, the darker the words became. Descriptions of choices made, secrets kept, and the guilt that had followed him for years. "This is my father's journal," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling. He could feel the weight of the past pressing in on him, the memories flooding back. He remembered his father's strict lessons, his stern looks, and the distance that had grown between them over the years. But reading these words, these raw, confessional words, he felt like he was seeing his father for the first time, not as a man to be feared, but as a man who had struggled with his own demons. The priest's voice broke through his thoughts. "Your father tried to protect you, Samuel, but there were things he couldn't protect you from. He knew what you would face. He knew the cost of redemption." Samuel's hands shook as he closed the journal. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was more complicated than he had ever imagined. His past, his choices, his father's secret struggles, they were all connected in ways that Samuel couldn't fully understand yet. "Redemption doesn't come without a price," the priest whispered, stepping closer. "And now it's your turn to pay it." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The weight of his father's secrets, the burden of his own choices, all of it was coming to a head, and there was no running from it anymore. Samuel stood there, the journal heavy in his hands. The weight of the pages seemed to press down on him, each word in his father's handwriting sinking deeper into his chest. He could feel the heaviness of the past tugging at him, threatening to pull him under. The priest stood silently beside him, watching, waiting. "What do you want me to do with this?" Samuel whispered, his voice raw. "Why show me this now?" The priest took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because it's time, Samuel. It's time for you to see the truth. All these years, you've lived with the burden of your father's choices, thinking they were your own. But they weren't. He kept the truth from you, his secrets, his sins, and you've carried them ever since. Now it's time for you to understand the weight of what he carried." Samuel's mind was a whirlwind, the flood of memories and emotions overwhelming. His father had always been distant, a man of few words, always trying to teach him discipline, to prepare him for a world that had never seemed fair. But this journal, this glimpse into the man Samuel had never really known, showed a side of him that was raw, vulnerable. His father wasn't just a stern figure in Samuel's life. He was a man who had struggled with his own demons, with the choices he had made. "I never knew," Samuel muttered, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. "I never knew he was this way." The priest's voice was calm but firm. "You never knew because he kept it from you. But now you know, and it's time to make a choice. Will you continue running from the truth? Or will you face it, just as your father did before you?" Samuel stared at the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of his father's secrets felt like a chain wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. But there was something else too, something he hadn't expected. A flicker of understanding, a flicker of empathy for the man his father had been. "You want me to forgive him," Samuel said slowly, the realization hitting him like a wave. "But how can I? How can I forgive him for keeping this from me, for making me live with his lies?" The priest's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his voice gentler now. "Forgiveness doesn't come easily, Samuel. It's not about absolving someone of their wrongs. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their actions. It's about understanding that, no matter how much you suffer, your past does not define you." Samuel's chest tightened. The words seemed to cut through the layers of anger and pain he had built over the years. He had spent so long blaming his father for everything, for his own failures, for the feeling of being abandoned. But now, standing in this broken church, holding his father's journal, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. "I don't know if I can forgive him," Samuel said, his voice cracking, "but I can't keep running from this. From the truth." The priest nodded, his face unreadable, but there was a quiet approval in his eyes. "You don't have to forgive him today, Samuel. Forgiveness is a process, a long road that you must walk in your own time. But you've taken the first step, and that's more than most ever do." Samuel swallowed hard, feeling a knot in his throat. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep carrying the weight of his father's secrets any longer. It was time to face them, to confront the truth about his past, no matter how painful it was. The priest turned and began to walk toward the back of the church, his steps slow but sure. "There's one more thing," he said without turning around. "You may not be ready to face everything all at once, but the truth is waiting, and it will find you whether you're ready or not." Samuel stood there for a moment, his hands still clutching the journal. His thoughts swirled, torn between anger and understanding, fear and resolve. The priest's words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise all at once. And then slowly Samuel followed him. The heavy door of the church creaked as Samuel followed the priest down a narrow hallway, the dim light from a single flickering bulb casting long shadows along the walls. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cold, empty space. As they reached the back of the church, Samuel's eyes settled on a door at the end of the hall, small, unassuming, yet it seemed to hold something important, something he wasn't ready to face. The priest paused before the door and turned to Samuel, his face a mask of calm. "This is the place," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "The place where your father made his last choice." Samuel felt a cold chill run through him. What did the priest mean by his last choice? What had his father done? And why was he standing here on the edge of something so painful, so personal? Taking a deep breath, Samuel stepped forward. His heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every part of him wanted to turn around, to escape the overwhelming tension, but he couldn't. He was already here. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The priest opened the door slowly, revealing a small room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls, and a single wooden chair sat in the center of the room, facing an old desk. On the desk, there were more papers, some scattered, some neatly arranged, and a small leather-bound book that caught Samuel's attention. Without thinking, he stepped inside and moved toward the desk, his eyes drawn to the book. As his fingers hovered over it, the priest spoke. "That book," the priest said quietly, "was your father's confession." Samuel's throat tightened. A confession? What could his father have possibly confessed to? His mind raced, but his hand reached for the book as if it were drawing him in. The cover of the book was old, worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. As Samuel flipped it open, his eyes scanned the first few words. They were written in his father's unmistakable handwriting. "I have failed you, Samuel. I have failed us both." Samuel felt his stomach twist. His father, the man who had always seemed so strong, so unyielding, had felt this way. What had happened? What had driven him to write this? The words on the page blurred as Samuel's eyes filled with unshed tears. He kept reading, each sentence more painful than the last. "There are things in my past that I cannot undo. Choices I made when I was young, choices that have haunted me ever since. I have kept this from you, hidden it away in the dark corners of my mind, hoping you would never have to know. But you need to know the truth, Samuel. I need you to understand what I've done." The confession continued, detailing a history of decisions that Samuel had never imagined. Choices that involved people he had never known, secrets that had shaped his father's life in ways that were unimaginable. As Samuel read, his heart ached, a mix of disbelief and sorrow flooding him. His father had been a part of something far darker, something more dangerous than he could have ever realized. The priest stood behind him, watching silently, as if giving Samuel space to absorb the weight of the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel closed the book, his hands trembling. He could barely breathe. His father's sins, his mistakes, everything had been laid bare. "I don't know if I can forgive him," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "He kept this from me." "All this time," the priest nodded, his expression soft. "Forgiveness is not for him, Samuel. It's for you. Letting go of this burden, letting go of the anger and pain, will set you free, Monzo. But that choice is yours to make." Samuel stood there in the small room, feeling the weight of everything around him. His father's secrets, the priest's words, the truth he had uncovered. It all felt like a storm swirling inside of him, pulling him in different directions. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep carrying the burden of the past any longer. The journey toward redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about understanding it, accepting it, and finding a way to move forward. He took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on the confession book. and made his choice. "I'm ready," Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. The priest's smile was small, but it held something deep, something like approval. "Then the path ahead is yours to walk, Samuel. But remember, redemption is not a destination. It's a journey." With those final words, Samuel left the room, his mind clearer than it had ever been. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was his to travel. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. As Samuel left the small room, the door creaked softly behind him, shutting out the haunting weight of his father's confession. The church's dim lighting seemed even more oppressive now, casting long shadows across the walls as if it were trying to swallow him whole. Every step he took away from the room felt like it was pulling him further into the unknown, and the stillness of the church wrapped around him like a shroud. The priest had not moved from his spot by the door, his hands folded calmly in front of him. His gaze was steady, and when Samuel walked past him, the priest spoke again, his voice calm but filled with an unspoken challenge. "You've seen the truth, Samuel," the priest said softly, "but understanding the truth is only the first step. The next step is the hardest one, to forgive, not just your father, but yourself." Samuel felt a tightness in his chest, his mind reeling with everything he had just learned. His father, who he had always viewed as a man of unwavering strength, the anchor of his life, had been carrying a burden of guilt and shame that had now been passed down to him. He had spent his life avoiding the truth, avoiding the reality of his own mistakes and regrets. And now it all lay in front of him, undeniable, exposed. "I don't know if I can forgive him," Samuel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his thoughts. "How can I forgive him for keeping all of this from me? For making me live in a lie all these years?" The priest nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Samuel. It doesn't mean excusing what was done. It means freeing yourself from the chains of the past so that you are no longer bound by it." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The priest's words felt like a revelation, but they also seemed like a burden, an expectation. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of anger. It was about releasing the hold that the past had on him, about breaking free from the weight of the secrets and lies. And Samuel didn't know if he was ready for that. "But how?" Samuel whispered. "How do I do that? How do I let go of all this pain?" The priest stepped closer, his presence both comforting and intimidating. "It begins with acceptance, Samuel. Accept that your father was not perfect. Accept that his choices were his own and that they do not define you. Accept that you are not responsible for his mistakes, just as you are not responsible for the mistakes of others. And once you have accepted that, then you can begin to heal." Samuel closed his eyes, trying to take in the weight of the priest's words. He had spent so much of his life blaming his father for everything. The distance between them, the anger he had carried, the feelings of abandonment. But now, standing in this empty church, he realized that the burden of his father's mistakes had been his to carry all along, and it was time to let it go. "You have to forgive yourself too," the priest continued. "Forgiving yourself is the hardest part, because it means you must come face to face with your own faults. You cannot seek redemption if you are unwilling to see the places where you need to heal." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. He had always seen himself as the victim, as the one who had been hurt. But the priest was right. He had made his own mistakes. Choices he regretted, actions he had taken without thinking. He had been running from his own guilt for so long, but now he understood that he had to face it head on, just as he had faced his father's sins. "I'm not sure I'm ready to forgive myself," Samuel admitted quietly, his voice shaking. "But I want to try I want to stop running." The priest nodded, his face softening with approval. "That's all anyone can ask for, Samuel. The journey of redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about striving to be better, to face the darkness within and choose to move toward the light." For the first time since he'd entered the church, Samuel felt a small flicker of hope. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable burden. It was just a part of him, one that he could choose to face, one step at a time. The priest reached out, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Remember, redemption isn't something that happens in an instant. It's a path, not a destination. And you, Samuel, are already on it." As they walked out of the church, the morning light was beginning to break through the horizon, casting a soft glow over the town. Samuel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Samuel felt like he could face it. The air outside was crisp, the early morning light casting a soft glow over the dilapidated streets of Crescent Falls. Samuel stood at the church's entrance, the heavy wooden doors closing behind him, the sound of them echoing in the quiet stillness. The world seemed different now, somehow quieter, as if everything had slowed down just for him. The weight of the past still lingered, but there was something else too, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. The priest stood beside him, his presence calm and reassuring. He had said everything Samuel needed to hear. Now it was up to Samuel to take those words and make them his own. "I've never felt so lost," Samuel admitted, his voice soft as he looked out at the town before him. "It's like everything I've known, everything I've believed, is suddenly shattered." The priest nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "It's natural to feel that way. When we face the truth, it often feels like the ground beneath us is no longer solid. But remember, Samuel, the truth is not the enemy. It is the beginning of your journey." Samuel let the words settle in, allowing the stillness of the morning to wrap around him. For the first time, he felt as if he were truly seeing the world, not just the facade of it, but the raw, unfiltered reality. The lies, the mistakes, the hidden parts of himself and his father. It was all part of the journey now, and for the first time, he wasn't running from it. "You said redemption is a journey," Samuel said, his eyes meeting the priest's. "But how do I know I'm on the right path? How do I know I'm doing the right thing?" The priest smiled faintly, the wisdom in his eyes unwavering. "You won't always know. There will be moments when you doubt yourself, when the road ahead seems too difficult, too painful, but that is part of the journey. It's not about knowing every step. It's about choosing to move forward, even when the way is unclear. You must trust that each step you take will lead you closer to who you are meant to be." Samuel let the priest's words sink in, nodding slowly. He felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He couldn't change his past, but he could choose how to move forward. The road was long, but it was his. "I guess it's time to stop running," Samuel said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound sense of determination. The priest's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his touch grounding. "You're already on the path, Samuel. The hardest part is behind you." Samuel took a deep breath, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. The town before him seemed so ordinary, yet now it felt like an entirely new place, filled with possibility. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. He had the power to change, to heal, to find his own path. As he walked away from the church, the priest turned and disappeared into the shadows of the building, leaving Samuel to face the world alone, but not truly alone. The lessons he had learned would stay with him, a constant guide in the days to come. The journey wasn't over, but it was beginning anew. With each step Samuel took, the weight of his father's secrets seemed to lift a little more, and a flicker of peace began to replace the chaos inside him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost anymore. He was on the path to redemption, not just for his father, but for himself. The early morning sun warmed Samuel's face as he walked down the quiet street, the weight of his decision still settling into his bones. His mind was quiet, the thoughts that had once swirled with anxiety and guilt now replaced with a newfound clarity. It was a strange feeling to be at peace with the past, to finally understand the weight he had carried for so long. Yet deep within him, he knew this was just the beginning. As he walked, the old town of Crescent Falls slowly came to life. The sounds of birds singing and the distant hum of early morning traffic filled the air, a stark contrast to the stillness of the church he had left behind. Samuel glanced around, taking in the familiar sights, the worn sidewalks, the faded storefronts, the trees lining the streets. Everything felt the same, yet somehow everything had changed. He passed by the small cafe where he used to meet friends, his thoughts drifting back to simpler days when the world had seemed smaller, easier. But even then, in the quiet corners of his mind, he had known that something wasn't right. Something had always been off, something he had tried to ignore, hoping it would just disappear. And now, here he was, facing the truth that had been buried for so long. Samuel knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. His past had been too painful, too complicated. The lace, the secrets, the choices. It was all part of who he had been, but it didn't have to be part of who he would become. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, accepting it, and moving forward. He stopped in front of a small park, the same park he had visited countless times as a child. The swings creaked in the breeze, and the laughter of children echoed in the distance. It was a peaceful sight, but Samuel felt a pang of sadness. The innocence of childhood had been lost to him long ago, buried beneath layers of regret and fear. But now, as he stood there, he wondered if it was possible to find that innocence again, not in the past, but in the present. Taking a seat on a nearby bench, Samuel let his thoughts settle. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he had control over it. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But that was part of the process, wasn't it? Part of the redemption. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his fingers pausing over the screen as he saw the name. It was a message from his mother. "I know you're probably still processing everything, but I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. I've always been here for you, Samuel. Please don't shut me out." The message hit him harder than he expected. For years, he had kept his mother at arm's length, afraid to confront the pain he had felt from his father's absence, from the years of strained communication. But now, in this moment of clarity, he understood that it wasn't too late to rebuild those bridges. He could start fresh. He could begin to heal those old wounds. With a deep breath, Samuel typed a reply. "I'm ready to talk, Mom. Let's start over." He hit send and sat back, feeling a small weight lift from his chest. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the first step in rebuilding the relationships he had neglected, the first step in healing the scars of his past. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Samuel stood up, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The road to redemption was long, and it wouldn't be without its struggles. But for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. And for Samuel, that was enough. Samuel's phone buzzed again a few minutes later, but this time, it wasn't a message from his mother. Instead, it was a call, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, wondering if he should answer. The past had taught him to be cautious, to shut out the unknown, but today felt different. Today, he was ready to face what life threw his way. Taking a deep breath, Samuel answered, "Hello? Samuel, it's Father Michael." The voice on the other end was familiar yet distant, like it had been pulled from some forgotten memory. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Father Michael, the priest who had guided him through the darkness, who had shown him the path toward redemption. He hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon. "No, it's fine," Samuel replied, his voice steady. "What's going on?" "I've been thinking about our conversation in the church," Father Michael said, his voice warm but serious. "You've taken the first step, Samuel, but there's something else I need to tell you. Something important." Samuel's curiosity piqued, and he leaned forward slightly, sensing that the next words would be just as crucial as everything the priest had already shared with him. "What is it?" "The truth you are seeking. It's not just about your father," Father Michael said, pausing for a moment before continuing. "There are other things, other people, whose lives are tangled with your own. Your redemption, Samuel, involves not just forgiving those who wronged you, but also understanding the impact of your own actions on those around you." Samuel felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had thought that redemption was a solitary journey, one that began and ended with his own healing. But now it seemed that the priest was telling him that his path to peace was more complicated. It wasn't just about him, it was about the people in his life who had been affected by his choices, his silence, his absence. "Are you saying that I need to make amends with others?" Samuel asked, trying to process the priest's words. "Yes," Father Michael replied simply. "Redemption is not a one-sided affair. It's a healing process that spreads outward, touching those you've hurt, whether intentionally or not. The road ahead will be harder than you think, Samuel, but it's a path you must walk if you truly wish to heal. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the weight of the priest's words settle in. He had been so focused on the pain his father had caused him, on the wounds from his past, that he hadn't considered the people he had hurt along the way. His mother, his friends, even the strangers he had shut out over the years. They all deserved some part of his healing too. He looked out over the quiet street in front of him, the cars moving slowly, the early morning light casting long shadows. The world was still, but Samuel felt a shift inside him, a realization that the next step wasn't just about facing his father's past. It was about reconnecting with the people he had distanced himself from. "I understand," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'll reach out. I'll start making things right." Father Michael's tone softened, and Samuel could almost picture the kind smile on his face. "Good. Remember, redemption is not about perfection. It's about effort, understanding, and making the choice to move forward. Don't rush. The path is long, but you're on the right road now." As the call ended, Samuel sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the priest's words. He had thought that facing his past was the hardest part, but now he understood that the real challenge was in facing the people he had hurt, the relationships he had broken, and the connections he had abandoned. The road ahead was long, but it was the only road that would lead to true peace. Samuel took a deep breath and stood up, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. He wasn't sure where it would lead or how long it would take, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking in the right direction, a direction toward healing, toward understanding, and ultimately, toward redemption. The day seemed to stretch on as Samuel walked through the quiet streets of Crescent Falls, his thoughts swirling with the priest's advice, making amends, reaching out to the people he had distanced himself from over the years. The weight of the task ahead loomed over him, but with each step he felt a growing sense of purpose. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't keep running from the people who mattered, especially if he wanted to find true redemption. As he walked past familiar storefronts, Samuel's thoughts turned to his mother. He had avoided her for so long, afraid to confront the pain of his past, the anger he had buried deep inside. But after his conversation with the priest, he knew it was time. It was time to stop blaming her for the mistakes his father had made. It was time to face the truth of their relationship and begin rebuilding it. Samuel stopped in front of his mother's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been here in months. The house looked the same as it always had, the flower boxes on the windows still colorful, the front porch light glowing softly in the fading daylight. But for Samuel, the house had always been a place of guilt, a place where unresolved tensions lingered. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his phone and dialed her number. The sound of the ringing in his ear was almost deafening, but he didn't hang up. He had to do this. He had to make the first step. After what felt like an eternity, his mother's voice came through the line, warm but cautious. "Samuel, is everything okay?" For a moment, Samuel didn't know what to say. He had so much to apologize for, so much to explain. But the words seemed to catch in his throat. He swallowed hard before speaking. Mom, I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been running from everything, from you, from the truth. I've been so angry, and I didn't know how to face it. But I'm ready now. I want to fix things." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Samuel could hear the faint sound of his mother's breath, as if she were trying to process his words. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, filled with emotion. "I've been waiting for you to say that, Samuel," she said quietly. "I know things haven't been easy between us, but I've always been here for you, even when you couldn't see it. I want us to move forward. I want to heal too." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he could speak again. But the weight in his chest began to lift as he realized that this was the beginning of something new. The healing process wasn't just about him, it was about both of them, learning to forgive and rebuild what had been broken. "I'll come over," Samuel said, his voice steadier now. "Let's talk. We have a lot to work through, but I'm ready. I don't want to run anymore." His mother's voice broke into a relieved laugh. "I've missed you, Samuel. Take your time, but I'll be waiting." As he hung up the phone, Samuel stood still for a moment, the enormity of the moment sinking in. This was the first step in the process of forgiveness, of mending the relationships he had broken. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a necessary step toward redemption. With a deep breath, Samuel turned toward his mother's house and walked up the path to the front door. The past, with all its pain and regret, was still there, lingering behind him. But now he had a choice: to leave it behind and move forward, or to continue carrying it. And for the first time in years, Samuel knew that he was ready to move forward. Samuel stood at the doorstep, his hand hovering over the doorbell. The old wooden door in front of him seemed to loom larger now, an imposing reminder of everything that had kept him away. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment, he wondered if he was making a mistake. Was he ready for this? Was he ready to face all the emotions, the years of silence, the words left unspoken? But then he thought of the priest's words: redemption is a journey. It wasn't just about facing his own darkness. It was about rebuilding the bridges he had burned, about finding a way back to the people he had hurt along the way. With a deep breath, Samuel pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed in the quiet, almost too loud in the stillness of the evening. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there she was, his mother. Her face was a mixture of surprise and relief, her eyes filled with a warmth that Samuel hadn't seen in years. "Samuel," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I wasn't expecting you, but I'm glad you're here." Samuel didn't know what to say. The weight of everything that had passed between them seemed to hang in the air, but he couldn't let it stop him. He had to say it. He had to start somewhere. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so lost for so long. I've been angry. I've been running, and I didn't even realize how much I've hurt you. I'm sorry for everything, the silence, the distance. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." Tears welled up in his mother's eyes as she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, Samuel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll figure this out, one step at a time." As Samuel entered the house, he noticed how little had changed. The familiar smell of his mother's cooking, the old photographs on the walls, the worn furniture. It was all exactly as he remembered, but it was different now. He was different. For the first time, he wasn't just walking into this house as a son burdened by past mistakes. He was walking in with the intention to heal, to make things right. They sat down at the small kitchen table, the same one where they had shared countless meals in the past. The quiet seemed almost comforting now, no longer a reminder of the years of silence between them, but a space where they could finally speak. Samuel reached out, taking his mother's hand in his. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About my father, about me, about us. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for all the time I wasted, for all the years I spent blaming you and him. But I need you to know that I'm ready to stop running. I'm ready to face everything that's been holding me back." His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "Samuel, you don't have to carry all this by yourself. I've been waiting for you to come back. I've been waiting for you to come back to me, to us." The words hit Samuel like a wave, and he felt something shift inside of him. All these years, he had been so focused on the pain and the anger, on the things he couldn't change, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. The people who had always been there for him, even when he wasn't ready to face them. "I don't know how to fix everything," Samuel said, his voice cracking, "but I want to try. I want to rebuild what we've lost, together." His mother smiled through her tears, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We'll take it one day at a time, Samuel. We'll figure it out together." For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the weight of his past beginning to lift. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the steps he had taken today felt like the beginning of something new. A new chapter, not just for him, but for the people he cared about. As he sat at the table with his mother, the house around them seemed to embrace them in a way it never had before. And for the first time in years, Samuel felt at home. The evening wore on quietly, the weight of the conversation between Samuel and his mother lingering in the air like a breath held too long. They shared a simple meal, not one filled with grand gestures or apologies, but one that felt right, the kind of meal that had been shared in their home many times before. Simple, comforting, the kind that reminded Samuel of the small moments they had once taken for granted. As the plates were cleared and the dishes were washed in silence, Samuel couldn't help but notice how the space between them, once thick with years of unresolved pain, now seemed to shrink. Every word they spoke, every glance, felt like a step closer to the healing they both needed. There was still so much to rebuild, so much to understand, but the foundation had been laid. The night was settling in, the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around them, when Samuel finally broke the silence. "Mom," he began, his voice uncertain, "I've spent so much time blaming my father for everything that's wrong in my life. But I realize now that I've been running from my own mistakes. I've been running from the truth of what I did and what I didn't do." His mother paused in her cleaning, her hands resting on the edge of the sink as she turned to look at him. "You don't have to carry all of that alone, Samuel. We all make mistakes. We all have things we regret. It's not about the mistakes themselves. It's about how we move forward from them." Samuel's chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been running from so many things, his father's sins, his own regrets, the guilt he felt for not being there for her in the way she needed. It was as though he had carried a backpack full of heavy rocks for years, each one representing a mistake, a regret, a lie. And now he was finally willing to put it down. "I don't know where to start," Samuel admitted, his voice raw. "I've neglected so many people in my life. I've neglected you. I don't even know how to make things right." His mother's smile was soft, gentle. "You've already started, Samuel. You've taken the hardest step of all by acknowledging it. And you're here now. That's enough for me." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment all he could do was sit there, letting the quiet comfort of her presence wash over him. The shame, the guilt, the weight that had been suffocating him for so long. It wasn't gone, but it was starting to feel more manageable. "I want to be better," Samuel said, his voice steady now. "For you, for me, for everyone I've hurt along the way." She walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to be perfect, Samuel. You just have to be honest with yourself. You've already shown that you're willing to face your past. That's the first step to making it right." Samuel nodded, feeling a sense of resolve build inside him. It wouldn't be easy. There were still so many things left unsaid between them, so many layers of hurt and misunderstanding. But the walls that had kept them apart for so long were beginning to crumble piece by piece. He wasn't ready to heal it all overnight, but he was ready to start. "I'll keep trying," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "One day at a time." His mother kissed him gently on the cheek, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "That's all anyone can do, Samuel. One day at a time." As he stood up to leave, Samuel felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't just about reconciling with his mother. It was about accepting that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And he was on his way, step by step, learning to face the past and walk into the future with the hope that he could rebuild, piece by piece, the life he had once nearly given up on. The days following his conversation with his mother felt like a quiet but powerful transformation for Samuel. He had taken the first steps toward healing, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. Each conversation he had, each apology he offered, brought with it a mix of relief and lingering doubt. He knew he was doing the right thing, but it wasn't easy. There was still so much to untangle, so many layers of pain and regret to peel back. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose guiding him, a sense of hope that things could change. One afternoon, Samuel found himself walking through the old park where he had spent so much time as a child. The familiar smell of freshly cut grass and the laughter of children echoed in the distance, but this time it felt different. The park that had once been a backdrop to his simpler, more carefree years now served as a quiet reminder of the life he was trying to rebuild. He sat on one of the benches, his hands resting in his lap, his mind drifting back to his conversation with the priest. The priest had said that redemption was a journey, not a destination, and Samuel was beginning to understand the depth of those words. There was no single moment of redemption, no magical fix that would make everything right again. It was about moving forward, one step at a time, and accepting that the past, no matter how painful, was a part of him. But it didn't define him. As Samuel sat there, Reflecting on everything he had learned, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his old friend Jake, who he hadn't spoken to in months. The message was simple, but it hit Samuel harder than he expected. "Hey, I know we've had our differences. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I'm sorry for how things ended. Would you be open to meeting up?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from Jake. Their falling out had been painful, full of unspoken words and unresolved tensions. The friendship that had once felt so strong had ended abruptly, leaving a lingering bitterness that had festered for too long. But now, reading Jake's message, Samuel realized that this was another part of his journey, a chance to make things right, to heal another broken piece of his past. Without hesitation, Samuel typed a response. "I'd like that. Let's meet tomorrow." The message sent, Samuel sat back on the bench, his heart racing with a mix of anticipation and fear. The road to redemption wasn't just about reconciling with his family. It was about repairing the relationships he had neglected, the bonds he had broken. And meeting with Jake was the next step in that process. As Samuel looked up at the sky, the clouds shifting overhead, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what the future held or how long this journey would take, but for the first time, he knew he was ready. Ready to face the people he had hurt, ready to face the parts of himself he had buried, and ready to rebuild the life he had almost lost. The past would always be with him, but it didn't have to control him. The future was his to shape, and with each step forward, he was reclaiming the life he deserved. The following afternoon, Samuel made his way to the cafe where he had arranged to meet Jake. He had spent most of the morning thinking about their past, about the things that had driven them apart. The years of friendship, followed by the bitter end, felt like a distant memory now. But the emotions still lingered: guilt, regret, and the faint hope that they could rebuild what had been lost. As Samuel walked into the small cafe, he scanned the room for Jake. It wasn't hard to find him. Jake's broad shoulders and familiar posture stood out even in the crowded space. He was sitting at a table near the window, looking out at the busy street. When Jake saw Samuel approach, he stood up, his expression guarded but welcoming. "Samuel," Jake said, his voice uncertain, but there was a softness in his tone that hadn't been there before. "It's been a long time." Samuel nodded, offering a hesitant smile. "Yeah, it has." They sat down across from each other, and for a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said quietly. "About everything, and I realized I was wrong. I should have tried harder. I shouldn't have let things get as bad as they did." Samuel looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in Jake's voice. "I've been thinking about it too. I should have reached out sooner. I shouldn't have let pride and anger keep me away." Jake nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's just, everything got so messy, you know? We both said things we didn't mean, and then we just stopped talking." "I know," Samuel replied, his voice tight. "I pushed you away. I didn't know how to handle everything I was feeling, and I didn't know how to fix it, but that's no excuse." Jake looked up, meeting Samuel's eyes. "I should have been there for you, man. You were going through a lot, and I just shut down. I thought I was giving you space, but really, I was just being selfish." Samuel exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The weight of the past didn't disappear in that moment, but hearing Jake's apology, hearing him acknowledge the mistakes they had both made, was the first step in healing their friendship. "I'm sorry too," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't there when you needed me, and I should have been. I was so caught up in my own stuff that I couldn't see how much I was pushing you away. I should have done better." For the first time in years, Samuel felt like a burden had been lifted from his chest. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about understanding the role he had played in their falling out and owning up to it. And in that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about the other person. It was about forgiving himself too. Jake gave him a small, genuine smile. "It's good to hear you say that. I don't expect things to be the same right away, but I think we can fix this." Samuel smiled back, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I'd like that. I really would." The conversation flowed more easily after that. the tension easing as they talked about old memories, shared experiences, and the years they had lost. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was the beginning of something real, something that Samuel hadn't realized he'd needed so much. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a golden light over the cafe, Samuel felt a quiet sense of peace settle in. The journey to redemption, to healing, was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. And that, he realized, was the most important part of the journey. As Samuel left the cafe, the weight on his shoulders felt noticeably lighter. It was like a long-held breath that he hadn't even known he was holding had finally been exhaled. Reconnecting with Jake had been something he had avoided for far too long, but now that it had happened, it felt like a bridge that had once been broken was beginning to rebuild itself, brick by brick. The walk home felt different. The air smelled fresher. The world seemed a little brighter. The peace that had come from mending old wounds stayed with him. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but there was hope now. The tension that had been with him for years had loosened, and while he knew there was more to fix, he also knew that he was on the right track. The evening was settling in, and as he walked through the quiet streets, he found himself thinking back to his conversation with his mother. They had a long way to go, but for the first time Samuel felt the possibility of a future where the past didn't have to hold them hostage. It was a slow process, and it would require patience and understanding, but the foundation was there. His mother had been waiting for him to reach out, just like Jake had. And now Samuel realized how much of that waiting had been tied to his own fears. His fears of facing the truth, his fear of seeing his own flaws. But with each conversation, each apology, and each step forward, those fears were starting to dissolve. There was strength in vulnerability, in admitting fault and seeking forgiveness. And while he wasn't sure what the future held, he knew that he couldn't move forward without embracing that strength. Samuel walked into his apartment, the familiar hum of city life outside the window providing a steady backdrop to his thoughts. He kicked off his shoes and sat down on the couch, looking at the quiet space around him. There were still empty places in his life, empty spaces where people should be, where connection had been lost. But tonight, he wasn't focused on what was missing. He was focused on what was right in front of him. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. Samuel glanced at it, expecting a message from his mother or maybe a follow-up from Jake. But it was a call from his old colleague, Emma. He hadn't spoken to her in months, not since he had distanced himself from everything and everyone. It was an unexpected call, but one that seemed to fit into the rhythm of his life today. He answered. "Hey, Emma," Samuel said, his voice still carrying the weight of the day's revelations. "Samuel?" Emma's voice came through warmly. "I've been thinking a lot about you. We've both been through some changes, haven't we?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Yeah, it feels like a lot has happened lately. It's been a journey." "It's good to hear your voice again," Emma continued, and Samuel could hear the sincerity in her tone. "I know things got complicated between us before, but I want you to know that I understand now. I know why you distanced yourself, and I don't hold it against you." Samuel's heart tightened, and for the first time he realized how much he had needed to hear that. "Thank you, Emma. I should have reached out sooner." "I understand," Emma replied, a note of relief in her voice. "But I'm glad we're talking now. I don't want the past to define what comes next. We're allowed to start over, right?" Samuel's chest felt lighter, the tension he hadn't even realized was there beginning to fade. "Yeah, I think we are." They spoke for a while longer, catching up on work and life, but the conversation felt different this time. There was an ease between them that had been absent for far too long, and as Samuel hung up the phone, he realized that this moment, just like the others, was another step in the right direction. He wasn't finished with his journey. There would be other difficult conversations, more challenges, and plenty of moments where doubt would creep in. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt like he was building something stronger than the past. He was building connections, rebuilding the bridges he had once burned, one step at a time. And that, he knew, was the true path to redemption. The following weeks seemed to fly by for Samuel. Each day, a new layer of his past came into focus, some more painful than others, but all essential for the healing he sought. With every apology, with every conversation, he felt something shift inside him. The walls he had built around himself for so long were crumbling piece by piece. But with that destruction came a new sense of freedom. Freedom to be vulnerable, to confront his mistakes, and most importantly, to move forward. One evening, as Samuel was walking through the familiar streets of Crescent Falls, he felt a sense of change in the air. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, and the cool breeze carried the scent of fresh rain. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel possible. Yet, in the back of his mind, there was still one conversation that lingered. A conversation he had been avoiding for far too long. He had yet to speak to his father, the man whose secrets had shaped his life, whose choices had torn their family apart. Samuel had spent years avoiding the truth of what his father had done, not because he didn't love him, but because confronting it felt like facing an impossible mountain. But now Samuel knew he couldn't keep running. He had forgiven so many, but he hadn't yet forgiven the man who had set the course of his life in motion. Samuel arrived home, and as he stood at his door, he pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a moment, his finger hovering over the number. It had been years since he'd spoken to his father. The call felt monumental, like something that could change everything. Finally, he pressed the dial button. His heart raced as the phone rang, each second stretching longer than the last. He had no idea what he would say, but it felt necessary, more necessary than anything he had done before. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was rough, older than Samuel remembered, but still unmistakable. His father. "Dad?" Samuel's voice was steady, though his chest tightened. "It's Samuel." There was a long pause, the sound of his father's breath on the other end. "Samuel, it's been a long time." "I know," Samuel replied, his voice softer now. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. About the things I've been running from." His father exhaled, the sound heavy with years of unsaid words. "I don't know if I can fix what's been broken, son. I've made so many mistakes. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I can't change that." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years blaming his father, resenting him for what had happened, but in that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about understanding it and forgiving it. "I don't know if I can change the past either," Samuel said, his voice quieter, "but I can't keep carrying this anger. I don't want to keep running from it. From you." There was another long silence, and then his father spoke, his voice filled with a mix of regret and relief. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I didn't know how to be the father you needed. I failed you." Samuel's eyes welled up, the raw emotion of the moment hitting him all at once. He had always wanted his father to apologize, to acknowledge the pain he had caused. But now he realized that he didn't need that apology to move forward. He needed to accept his father's flaws, just as he had accepted his own. "I've made mistakes too," Samuel said softly, "but I want to start again. I don't want to carry this pain anymore." His father's voice broke through the silence again, quieter, almost as if he were finally admitting something to himself. "I don't know where to start, son, but I want to try. For you, for us." Samuel's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with a quiet sense of peace. The road to forgiveness wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But in this moment, he knew they had both taken the first step toward healing. "I'm willing to try too," Samuel said, his voice firm with resolve. "One step at a time." And for the first time, Samuel realized that redemption wasn't just about repairing the broken pieces of the past. It was about understanding, accepting, and choosing to move forward with hope. The conversation with his father lingered in Samuel's mind for days, each word resonating in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, there was no anger, no resentment, just two people, both broken in their own ways, trying to make amends. Samuel had always thought that the healing would come from an apology, from some grand gesture that would erase the past. But now he realized it was the quiet moments, the willingness to show up despite the years of hurt, that truly mattered. As the days passed, Samuel found himself reconnecting with other parts of his life. With his mother, things were gradually improving. They began to talk more openly, sharing stories about the past, about the things they had both kept hidden for so long. It wasn't perfect. but every conversation felt like a step forward. And then there was Jake. Their friendship was still in its early stages of repair, but each time they met, the bond between them grew a little stronger. Samuel had always thought that the wounds between them were too deep to heal, but now he saw that the path to forgiveness wasn't linear. It was full of setbacks, yes, but also filled with the possibility of renewal. But there was still something missing, something Samuel hadn't quite figured out. Despite the progress with his father and the small steps forward with his friends and family, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was one final piece of the puzzle he had to confront: himself. One evening, as Samuel sat alone in his apartment, he looked around at the quiet, empty space. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. He had come so far, and yet there was still this lingering sense of unfinished business. He had forgiven others, but had he forgiven himself? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Samuel sat on the couch staring at the walls that had once felt so familiar. He realized with a sudden clarity that his journey wasn't just about reconciling with his father or his friends. It was about accepting the parts of himself he had always tried to hide. The guilt, the anger, the shame, all of it had been a part of him for so long that he hadn't known who he was without it. With a deep breath, Samuel stood up and walked to the small window by his desk. The city was quiet, the lights below twinkling like stars in the night sky. As he gazed out over the view, he made a decision. It was time to stop running, not from his past, but from the person he had become in response to it. Taking a step back from the window, he moved toward his desk and pulled out the journal his father had written. He had avoided it for days, unsure of what more it might hold, but now he saw it differently. It wasn't just his father's confession. It was a key to understanding the legacy of pain and redemption they both shared. It was time to face it head on, to take responsibility for the person he had allowed himself to become. Opening the journal, Samuel began to read once more. The words were familiar, but they felt different now. As he read through his father's admissions, the weight that had burdened him for so long began to feel lighter, as if understanding the past allowed him to leave it behind. And then, as his father's handwriting continued on the pages, Samuel came across something new, something he hadn't seen before. A simple line written near the end of the journal. "I've done what I could, but my mistakes are mine alone. Samuel, it's your turn now." For the first time, Samuel understood. His father's redemption wasn't something he could give him. His father had done what he could, but it was up to Samuel to carry the lesson forward. His father's journey had ended, but Samuel's was just beginning. And in that moment, Samuel realized that his journey wasn't just about forgiving the past. It was about embracing the future, knowing that, like his father, he had the power to shape it. The path to redemption was his to walk now, and he was ready. The days that followed Samuel's realization were quiet, filled with moments of introspection and steady progress. He had come to understand that redemption wasn't a singular event. It was a constant process, a daily choice to learn from the past and move forward with intention. Though he had made significant strides in his relationships with his family and friends, Samuel now faced the most important challenge: rebuilding his own sense of self. One evening, as he sat by the window of his apartment, looking out at the city, Samuel thought back to the moment when his father had handed him the journal. The moment when he had begun to understand the deeper truths about himself. His father had written, "It's your turn now." Those words echoed in his mind. He had spent so much time waiting for others to change, for someone to fix the broken pieces of his life. But now he realized that it was up to him to do the work. His redemption wasn't something he could earn from anyone else. It was something he had to give himself. He picked up his phone and opened his notes app, staring at the blank screen for a moment. Writing had always been a way for him to process his thoughts, but it had been years since he'd allowed himself to put his feelings into words. Now it seemed like the right time to start. With a deep breath, Samuel began to type. "I forgive myself. I forgive myself for the things I've done and the things I've left undone. For the years of silence, the choices I regret. I forgive myself for the mistakes I made in my relationships, for the times I wasn't there when people needed me most. I forgive myself for hiding behind anger, for letting fear define my actions. I am ready to move forward. I am ready to let go. He paused, his fingers hovering over the screen. It felt strange, almost too simple to write those words. But as he read them over, a sense of peace settled in. The forgiveness he had so freely given to others was now something he was offering himself. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a beginning, a crucial step in the process. Samuel saved the note, feeling the weight of his thoughts lift just a little. He didn't know what the future held, but he was finally ready to embrace it, imperfections and all. The next day he decided to take a walk through the park once again. It had become a place of reflection for him, a quiet corner where he could think and process the changes in his life. As he walked along the familiar path, he saw a group of children playing, their laughter echoing in the open air. The scene felt peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt that peace inside himself. He sat on the same bench where he had sat weeks ago, the weight of the past now no longer suffocating him. He wasn't running from his past anymore. He had accepted it, the mistakes, the regrets, the pain. It was all part of who he was, but it didn't define him. Samuel looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily overhead. He didn't know where his journey would take him from here, but he had a sense of clarity he had never known before. The road to redemption was long, but it was also full of hope. He had already taken the hardest steps. Now it was just about continuing forward. In that moment, Samuel realized that life wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about learning to embrace the imperfections, to forgive, to grow, and to continue moving forward, one step at a time. The weeks that followed Samuel's moment of self-reflection were a mixture of quiet progress and new challenges. He had learned to embrace the process of change, understanding that true growth came from the small, everyday decisions. With every interaction, every attempt to make amends, he felt himself becoming more whole, as though the pieces of his past were no longer chains, but stepping stones towards something better. One afternoon, as Samuel sat at his desk, preparing for a new project at work, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. The message was short, but held weight. "I've been thinking. It's time for us to go through your father's things. He left behind so much. I think it might help us to finally close that chapter." Samuel stared at the message, his heart heavy with the thought of sorting through his father's belongings. For so long he had avoided the idea, seeing it as yet another reminder of the man who had made so many mistakes, and of the relationship that had been left unfinished. But now things were different. The thought of going through his father's things no longer filled him with dread. It was no longer about pain, it was about understanding, closure, and moving forward. He took a deep breath, then typed back, "I'll be there tomorrow." He knew it was time. He couldn't continue avoiding the past. The healing wouldn't come from keeping it locked away. It would come from facing it, from accepting it, and from making peace with it. The next day, Samuel drove to his mother's house. The air was crisp and the sky was a perfect shade of blue, but his thoughts were a mix of anticipation and unease. He didn't know what to expect when they opened the boxes that had been packed away for so long. But he knew one thing: it was a necessary step. When he arrived, his mother was already waiting for him. There were two boxes in front of her, one large, one small, both filled with old papers, photographs, and mementos from his father's life. Samuel sat beside her, the weight of the moment settling over them both. "Do you want to start with the small one, Shishwam?" his mother asked, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. Samuel nodded, picking up the smaller box and carefully opening it. Inside there were old letters, some tied with string, others neatly folded in yellowed envelopes. There was a photograph of Samuel as a child, sitting on his father's lap, both of them smiling. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet the image brought a strange comfort to Samuel. He handed the photograph to his mother, who smiled softly, though there were tears in her eyes. "I remember that day," she whispered. "He was so proud of you." Samuel's heart tightened as he took the photograph back. His father had always been distant, and Samuel had never truly understood the depth of his love. But now, looking at this image, he realized that his father had tried in his own way. His mistakes didn't negate the love he had for Samuel. They just made it complicated, harder to see. As they continued going through the box, Samuel found old notes from his father, written in the margins of books, half-finished thoughts, and scribbles that seemed to carry the weight of years of regret. There was no grand confession, no moment of clarity. Instead, there were fragments. A man who had struggled with his own demons, just like Samuel had. This was his way of trying to make sense of everything, Samuel said quietly. He didn't know how to fix it, and he didn't know how to talk about it, but he tried. His mother nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. We all have our own way of coping with pain. As they sat together, reading through the letters and memories, Samuel realized that this was not just a moment of closure, it was a moment of understanding. He didn't need to forgive his father all at once. But what mattered now is that he understood him. And in that understanding, he could begin to heal the final wound left by their fractured relationship. For the first time in years, Samuel felt a true sense of peace. The past was no longer an anchor holding him back. It was a chapter that had shaped him, but it no longer had to define his future. The process of sorting through his father's belongings continued for hours, with both Samuel and his mother quietly sifting through the memories. Each item seemed to hold its own story, its own piece of the puzzle that had made up his father's life. A tattered blanket, a collection of books, some old handwritten notes, all small glimpses into a man Samuel had once thought he understood, but now saw in a different light. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, Samuel and his mother sat together, exhausted but filled with a quiet sense of resolution. The boxes, once filled with so many unanswered questions, now lay empty before them. But the real work, Samuel knew, wasn't in the objects themselves. It was in the space they had created between them, the understanding they had reached. I never realized how much of him was still here, Samuel said, his voice soft as he looked at the empty boxes and scattered papers around them. His mother nodded, her expression pensive. He was a complicated man, but he loved you, Samuel. He just didn't always know how to show it. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years lift slightly from his shoulders. I understand that now. It's strange, but I think I finally see him for who he was. He wasn't perfect, and neither am I, but I think he did the best he could. There was a long pause, and then his mother smiled gently. It's a good thing to understand. It's what allows us to move forward. Samuel glanced at the photo of himself as a child, now sitting on the table between them. A small, nostalgic smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He remembered that moment, his father's hands firmly around him, the warmth of being close, and the feeling of being loved, even if it had been fleeting. You know, Samuel said thoughtfully, I think the hardest part wasn't what he did or didn't do. It was me not allowing myself to see him as a person, someone who made mistakes, just like I have. His mother's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his. We all carry that burden, don't we, with dog? We expect others to be perfect, but we don't give ourselves that same grace. It's easy to look at the past and think it should have been different, but the only thing we can change is what we do with what we have now. Samuel's chest tightened, and he nodded, understanding more than ever that his mother was right. The past, with all its pain and missteps, was a part of them, but it didn't have to be the lens through which they viewed their future. The lessons they had learned, the healing they had begun, would shape the path ahead. I've spent so much of my life looking back, trying to fix things that I couldn't, Samuel said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. But I think I'm ready now. Ready to stop looking back and start looking forward. His mother smiled, a mixture of relief and pride on her face. I'm proud of you, Samuel. It's not an easy thing to forgive, whether it's others or yourself, but you're on the right path. As Samuel stood to leave, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over, and there would be more to face, more to heal. But today he had taken one of the most important steps. He had reconciled with the past and had chosen to embrace the present. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time, Samuel felt ready to face it. Not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that redemption was not about perfection, but about acceptance. And he was ready to move forward, one step at a time. The following weeks felt like a fresh start for Samuel. With each passing day, he felt more grounded, more at peace with the choices he had made. He had done the hard work of looking back, sorting through the fragments of his past, confronting his father's mistakes and forgiving himself for the years of silence and anger. But now, as the world outside continued to spin, Samuel found himself more focused on the future than ever before. He spent more time with his mother, rekindling their relationship in ways he had never thought possible. They cooked meals together, shared old stories, and laughed in a way they hadn't done in years. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was progress. They both knew there was still work to be done, but every small step felt like a victory. Samuel's life no longer felt like a list of regrets and what-ifs. One evening, as he sat at the small kitchen table, he found himself thinking about the friendships he had once lost. Jake was the first person who came to mind. Their relationship had been built on years of trust, shared experiences, and mutual respect. But the fallout, the misunderstandings, it had broken them both. They had both been running from the truth, from their own failures, unable to see how much they needed each other. Samuel Heed knew he couldn't change the past, but what mattered now was moving forward. He pulled out his phone and stared at the contacts list for a moment before sending a message to Jake. "Hey, how about dinner tomorrow? I think we have a lot more to talk about." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. He needed to rebuild the friendships he had let slip through his fingers. And Jake, like so many others, deserved the opportunity to be part of the new chapter Samuel was beginning to write. The next evening, Samuel met Jake at a small restaurant in the center of town, the same place they had eaten at countless times before. When Jake arrived, he was surprised to see Samuel sitting at a table near the back, looking calm and collected, but with an expression that carried the weight of their shared history. "Hey," Jake said as he sat down, his voice cautious but not unkind. "I didn't expect to hear from you." Samuel smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Yeah, I know. I wasn't sure if I was ready either, but I think it's time we talked." They spent the next few hours talking, really talking. They revisited their old memories, discussed the fallout, and acknowledged the pain they had both carried. It wasn't easy. There were awkward silences and uncomfortable moments, but it was real. It was a conversation they both needed to have. "I've missed you, man," Jake said, his voice softening as they reached the end of the meal. "I've missed our talks, our laughs. I'm sorry for the way I handled things." Samuel looked at him, his own voice quieter now. "I missed you too. I was angry, and I shut you out. But I get it now. We were both hurting, and instead of talking, we just kept running." Jake nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "Yeah, it was easier to do that than face it. But I'm glad we're talking now. I think we can start again." The weight of the moment settled over them. Samuel knew that they weren't going to undo the years of silence in one conversation. It would take time, patience, and effort. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope for their friendship, a belief that maybe they could rebuild it, piece by piece. As they said their goodbyes that evening, Samuel felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace, the road ahead would have its challenges, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had learned the power of confronting the past, of forgiving, and of accepting that moving forward it didn't mean erasing the past. It meant learning from it. And as he walked back to his apartment, the city lights shimmering in the distance, Samuel felt a quiet sense of promise. The future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace with open arms and a willing heart. The weeks that followed Samuel's dinner with Jake felt like a continuation of the work he had been doing for months, rebuilding, healing, and forgiving. Each day brought new challenges, but with each step forward, Samuel found that the weight of his past was becoming less and less of a burden. It was as if the process of making amends had not only healed the relationships around him, but had also allowed him to heal parts of himself that he hadn't even realized were broken. Jake had become a consistent part of Samuel's life again. Their meetings weren't just about discussing the past. They were about building new memories. They laughed like they used to, shared the stories of their lives, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the warmth of genuine friendship without the shadow of unresolved issues hanging over them. One afternoon, as Samuel sat on his balcony, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. The message was simple but filled with weight. "I think it's time we visited your father's grave." For a moment, Samuel was still. The idea of visiting his father's grave had always seemed distant, something he thought he could avoid indefinitely. But now, after everything he had gone through, he realized it was the final piece, the last step in truly healing from the past. It wasn't about saying goodbye. It wasn't about finding closure in a single moment. It was about acknowledging the man his father had been, the mistakes he had made, and accepting that it was time for Samuel to let go of the anger he had carried for so long. The next morning, Samuel and his mother drove to the cemetery. The drive was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the car engine and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. Samuel's mind was full, not with thoughts of anger or regret, but with a quiet understanding that this visit wasn't just about his father, it was about him. It was about the years of pain he had held on to and the forgiveness he had granted to others, and now, finally, to himself. When they arrived, Samuel felt a wave of emotions wash over him. The cemetery was peaceful, the gravestones standing tall in the morning light, each one a testament to the lives that had once been. Samuel walked slowly, his mother beside him, until they reached his father's grave. He stood there for a long time, looking at the simple stone, his father's name etched into it. It was surreal to think that this was the end of the road for his father, that the man he had once resented now lay in a grave, just another part of the past. "I never thought I'd be here, Mom," Samuel said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But now it feels like the right time. I'm not angry anymore." His mother stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "I'm proud of you, Samuel. This wasn't an easy journey, but you've done it. You found peace, not just for him, but for yourself." Samuel looked down at the gravestone one last time, a feeling of release settling in his chest. "I forgive you, Dad," he whispered, though no one was there to hear. "And I forgive myself." In that moment, something shifted inside him. The anger that had once consumed him was no longer there. He had faced the past, acknowledged the mistakes, and most importantly, had learned to let go. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was a new beginning. As he turned to leave, Samuel felt a weight lift from his heart. He had forgiven the man who had shaped his life, not because he had to, but because he was ready to move forward. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had the power to hold him back.